It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce you to Jeffrey Pfeffer. And Jeff is a professor at Stanford and an author / co-author of 14 books. Another one I understand in the making, so like 14 and a half books. And so he's got lots and lots of areas of expertise, and we're here today to talk about his latest book, Leadership BS, which is nothing if not catchy as a title. And I am Karen May. I lead our people development team here at Google. And I know we're joined not only by folks in the room here today, but also by a number of folks in other locations via live stream. So welcome all of you. And I shared briefly with Jeff that a little bit of an embarrassing fact, which is that I don't read very many leadership books. And I tend to read the first chapter and feel like I kind of got the point, and maybe read like the first paragraph of the rest of the chapters. And you know, there tends to be a certain sameness. And so I left about that much time to read this book, which was no offense. But what I found when I started reading is I kind of put my feet up on the couch and leaned back and slowed down, and I said, oh, this is very interesting. This is really different. And so I was so pleased that I had the opportunity to directly ask you questions, because it was a very thought-provoking book. And I know we can't assume today that you've all had the chance to read it yet. I imagine many of you will following our conversation, because you too will be very intrigued. So I'd like to just start off with the first question, which, as I shared with you, I'm very curious, because you've written at least 2 books in one, maybe 3 with this book. And 2 of the themes that you wove together, one is essentially, excuse my paraphrase here, you can correct me if you like, is that the things that we say we want in our leaders are not necessarily the things that we get in our leaders, nor are they necessarily the things that are rewarded in our leaders. So we have a disconnect. Oh. Similarly, we have a multi-billion-dollar leadership development industry, which claims to help people develop into that former set of things that we say we want in our leaders, and yet doesn't do a good job of that. And so you have commentary on both of those states of affairs in this book, and I'm curious about why you wrote the book, and why you chose to address both of those important questions together. Okay.
Wow.
Sorry, no softball questions to get us started.
That's fine. So I wrote the book because I was angry, which turns out to make writing the book much quicker. You know, your emotion, motivation, whatever. I am increasingly frustrated by a combination of things. Number one, the people who would take my Path to Power class at Stanford and say to me, wow, your class is very different, which I always take as a compliment, because I take anything as a compliment at this point. You know, they say your class is very different. It contradicts what we've learned from other leadership books or what we've learned in other courses at Stanford, and that was kind of interesting. And then I, you know, frustrated by the fact that it's the dirty little secret. The Stanford Business School is, of course, very highly selective. We have extremely fabulously fantastic students. Probably now the most selective business school in the country, hardest to get into. And in spite of the fact that we are highly selective and have these brilliantly, stunningly wonderful human beings who come to us, within the first 24 months of their graduation from Stanford, a reasonably high, though since nobody studied it, I can't give you exact data, but my anecdotal evidence from talking to a few former students is that somewhere between 10 and 20% of our students will be fired within the first 2 years. So, you know, that's a high percentage. I mean, because these are highly selective, highly selected, fabulously fantastic people. The idea that one of them would be fired, let alone somewhere between 10 and 20%, is, I think, shocking. And of course, the reason why they're fired is because they believe the stuff they've been told in the other classes. And so I think we as an institution are failing. I certainly, so in my Path to Power class, I have as one of the objectives that you should never have to leave a job involuntarily. We got to prepare you so that you know how to survive in the world. That's the second thing. But the thing that makes me the angriest, of course, is the enormous amount of hypocrisy. I can tolerate people lying, cheating, and stealing, and doing everything else that's part of the world, and some of them are actually, I guess, now running for president. But in any event, what I don't take very well to is the hypocrisy. The people who stand up at our View from the Top series, or who go and write these books and describe them and their characteristics as a leader, which bear almost no resemblance to their behavior and to what they've done. And so we have, but many people in the world believe this. So you can read, Rudy Giuliani's book on leadership, or you can read, I'll get myself into plenty of trouble because this is broadcast, but his name's in the book, so I might as well say it. Bill George, who was CEO of Medtronic, and he wrote True North, which is a lovely book written with my dear friend and former student Pete Sims, and I actually very innocently served on not innocently served on the board. I was on the board with somebody who had worked with Bill George at Medtronic, and when True North came out, I said, "Wow, it must have been great to work with Bill." And the response was, "That's not the Bill George who I experienced." But this is not to say anything about Bill. I think this is typical. I think, I make a point in chapter 1 of this book to talk about why it is difficult for people to tell the truth even if they wanted to, which, by the way, in many instances they don't. I think memory's selective. We know from studies of recall, of auto accidents or crimes, that even if there's no incentive for you to misremember, memory's imperfect. And so we're certainly going to have motivated imperfect memory around what I did as a leader and how wonderful I was and how everybody loved me, even if they don't. By the way, if you want a little test of this, ask your friends and colleagues about failed relationships. You get distorted memory there too, often in a different direction. So that's kind of why I wrote the book. The reason why I wove the two themes together is because I think they're actually, I believe they may be related. That the reason why we say we want a set of characteristics and we don't get them is in part, I think, because we have a leadership industry that is living in some mythical world of the shoulds and the oughts, kind of like Sunday school, which is fine. I have nothing against religion, or Saturday school, or Friday school, depending upon your particular belief. I have nothing against religion, but I think we should not confuse, aspirational preaching or lay preaching with social science. And so to me, I think the two pieces are connected. That the reason why we have done such a lousy job, manifestly lousy job, of building, with the exception of Google and my friends at SAS Institute, who typically rank about in the top 5 on best places to work list every year. But for the most part, workplaces are horrible. The Gallup data suggests it's awful. Employees are disengaged, job satisfaction's horrible. My favorite statistic, which was picked up in the Economist review of this book last week, was, Parade magazine in 2012 said, "Would you rather have a substantial raise or be able to fire your boss?" And 35% of the people said, "Fire my boss." I think leaders are failing and not having a good experience either. So the leadership industry has failed, and I think the disconnect is not the only one, but it's one manifestation of the failure. So that's why I wove the two together.
So one of the things that you outline, in a sense, is we say we want these things: modesty, honesty, transparency, care for others, those kinds of things, and yet those things aren't rewarded. But there's this sort of glimmer of hope, if you will, that when done well, and not with leaders who go 100% in those directions, but leaders who lead well, there's a possibility that it actually can be both good for the organization and the leader's career and self-interest, but that the leader's career, the employees, and the organization, as 3 different kind of stakeholder groups, as you will, often create this triangle of tension with the leader in the middle, and they will solve first for their career, and often second for the organization, because those two tend to be best aligned, and it's the employees who suffer as a result. Is that an accurate?
I think that's quite fair.
So if we've got this stakeholder triangle and the potential of those actually being aligned to elicit behavior that works for the employee, the leader's career, the organization, and the employees, how do we begin to shift from a state where those are unaligned, which reinforces the disconnect, to one where they become better aligned?
Oh, that was a question I was going to ask you.
I got it out first.
Since you're a professional in this field. Well, you know, I'm not 100% sure that you actually can align it. I mean, it depends upon, again, what the literature you want to access and what scholarship you want to access. But one of the fundamental principles of sociobiology is that the interests of the individual and the interests of the group are frequently at odds with one another, because so if we were to take to take an extreme example, if someone were to roll a live hand grenade into this room, well, what's good for the group is for somebody to throw their body on it, but that's not what's good for that individual. And there are many ways in which what produces individual fitness and what produces the best outcomes for the group are not aligned. You want parents to forego food so that their children can live, or you want the individuals. I guess the best example would be the Donner Pass. Hopefully we'll have snow this winter. But the Donner Party getting stuck in the thing, and some people, I don't think they volunteered, but anyway, being eaten by the rest of the Donner Party so they could survive the travail. That would be, again, unaligned interests. I'm not sure that it is possible to completely align the interests. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that many of the qualities that we say we want are not only not what we don't apparently want, but I'm not even sure they're even good for people or whatever. So, you know, one of my favorites is authenticity, which we can talk about later.
Let's do it now. That was one of my questions too. Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
The authenticity, because one of the things that you said that caught my attention was that authenticity can actually be bad for an organization, and we all talk about authenticity. So say a little bit more about when authenticity becomes problematic or toxic.
Well, authenticity, well, first of all, like much of the leadership stuff, I mean, you can find, if you search for authenticity on my favorite search engine, which is in fact Google, you get like a billion definitions, or a lot of definitions, many of which are basically like a list of positive attributes that don't comport to any kind of definition of authenticity that I would believe. But if you look at the more fundamentally scholarly literature on authenticity, it says it talks about being true to yourself. And I don't believe that leaders need to be true to themselves at all. They need to be true to what the human beings around them need and want. So one of the examples I use in the book, I have a dear friend whose daughter fell in with a bad crowd. Her boyfriend gave her drugs. She had an overdose. 5 months later, she was dead. But unfortunately, she did not die that night, which would have been better for everybody. And as he and his wife watched her die, and I could describe that if anybody wants, what that process is like to be brain dead and have your muscles atrophy. And even though most of the brain is not functioning, the pain of the muscles contracting. So there's this poor, basically unconscious human being screaming. And he was a very senior administrator in a university. And, you know, for the first minute or two or week or day or whatever, people are sympathetic. And they are always, of course, concerned for him and about him. But sooner or later, he has to go back to work. And his team, much as they love him and as wonderful as he is, fundamentally, after a while, they forget. It is about, you know, you need to serve the group. We need your energy. We need your commitment. We need your emotional involvement. We need your, you know, we need your leadership in the sense of strategic direction and all these other things. And I can assure you that there were many days, there probably still are many days, when he wakes up and the last thing he wants to do is go to work at some, you know, higher education university position, because as he said, you lose a child, it will stay with you all your life. And, you know, it is a sadness which is an ineffable part of his soul. But on the other hand, that's not what you've been hired for, and you have to show up and do something different. The less extreme example, Gary Loveman, who's just stepped down as CEO of Caesars Entertainment, first time he came to my class, because I wrote a case on him, he was running 101-degree temperature. He had the flu. No sentient human being with 101-degree temperature wants to do 4 hours of class with me. So if he's being true to himself, I want to be home in bed. But part of the job of a leader is to convey, and he would do this when he would show up at his casinos, more important than my class. People need, as he would say, as he said once to my class in a video which I've seen so often now it's like memorized, people need your energy. They need your physical energy, they need your intellectual energy, they need your emotional energy, and they need your energy even if at that moment in time you've got marital trouble, or your children are acting up, or you don't feel well. People need your energy, and so the idea of being authentic to yourself, it seems a little too self-centered. And it's not. The leader. You show up in the leadership role. You have a responsibility to the people you're being led by, and so part of the skill of being a leader is the ability, I think, to act in ways that you're not necessarily feeling at the time. I may be tired, I may be depressed, I may be distracted, but in terms of getting the job done, I have to show up in a fully present, engaged, energetic way. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So it comes in a sense back to the definition of authenticity, and also to one of the points you make about the leadership training industry is we sort of glamorize and perhaps exaggerate these traits, so that authenticity means being completely and utterly vulnerable and open at all times. And if that's
and being true to your wants and needs.
Right, being true to your own wants and needs versus a more realistic definition, which might have to do with evaluating what your team needs from you or what your organization needs from you, checking to make sure you're not violating fundamental values, and defining authenticity on a longer term scale than an in the moment, how am I doing? But what's the connection for me there is when our industry defines things in an unrealistic way or an idealistic way, we set a standard that's unrealistically high. And that then becomes something that people can't achieve, and that exaggerates perhaps the gap that already exists.
I think that's right. And also we presume, authenticity is kind of an interesting thing because it presumes you need to be true to your authentic self. But which authentic self? Your authentic self when you were, 18 months old? One of the other stories is my favorite example. Is my dear friend Allison Davis Blake. I like to say I knew Allison Davis Blake before she was hyphenated. I knew where she was Allison Davis, and was probably the world's shyest doctoral student that you could ever possibly imagine. The most, could hardly speak up in class. If she spoke up, you would not know because you couldn't hear her. And she's today she's just stepping down as Dean of the Ross School at the University of Michigan, and she's probably going to go on to be a provost or a university president. And if you talk to Allison, she will tell you, she's still, I don't think she did a personality transplant or something. She is still basically an introvert. But she said to be an introvert, define it, I don't know, whatever, to be true to that, she said, I figured out after a while that the behaviors associated with that label, being introverted, was not very useful for my career. I was not going to be able to be a dean or a president or an associate dean or probably even a functioning teacher if I was going to be that shy so that nobody could hear me. And so I believe, which is one of the themes of the class I teach, is that human beings, you don't have to change who you are, but you need to change your behaviors. And that we can all learn and adopt behaviors that make us better able to function. So she's a fabulous public speaker. She's, she's obviously been extremely successful, and she will be a provost or a university president of a major university. And if you had known her in 1986, if there had been a list of 1,000 people who was going to be a dean or university president, she would have been last on the list. And this is partly, I will in her case, saying to herself, I will reinvent myself. I will develop skills and resilience and toughness that I never thought I had. And that's I think, just perfect.
So the self evolves, and we need to allow space for that. Many of the examples in your book focus on CEOs. Kind of the senior level executive who I might hypothesize are more subject to the tension in the stakeholder triangle, if you will, than some others. But I'm curious, because you spoke mostly about them, do you see the same disconnect kind of all levels of leaders and managers, or is it does it get worse at the top? No.
It's probably, well, no, actually, I think it's easier at the top because most people at the top, well, particularly not at the top because of their company founders, but they've worked their way up, have overcome anything that worries them about except their own careers, in case you haven't been reading the newspaper, about people who are pretty much self-interested. I mean, many of the studies that we cite, that I cite, are studies of people throughout the career course. I mean, the effect of narcissism on career success has been studied at the level of presidents, but it's also been studied at the levels of selection into the officer ranks in the military. So I think this holds throughout the career. And I see you have coming, or somebody told me at lunch you have coming, my good friend Adam Galinsky, friend or foe, and that is a different kind of issue, but another kind of tension, because people are both friends and foes in the same time. In organizational hierarchies, you are both peers and competitors. So you have to collaborate and cooperate at the same time. That's right. You have to look out for the organization's interests to some extent. You have to look out for your own interests. As my dear friend Joel Podolny, who works for a company you may have heard of called Apple, when I wrote the book before this, Power, he and I met at Apple, and food's not as good as here, but in any event, we had this wonderful discussion in which he said, you basically are telling people that they need to take care of themselves. And I said, well, Joel, I said, you haven't been at Apple for all that long, but 30 or 40 years ago in the Silicon Valley, there became a mantra, and I don't know if this is true at Google, but I suspect it is, and the mantra that came out of the Silicon Valley and still exists is that we are not responsible for your career. You are responsible for your career. We are responsible to give you interesting jobs. We are responsible to give you learning opportunities and growth opportunities. But in most companies, and I suspect Google is one of them, first thing you should do when you either get recruited or sign on, you should sign an at-will statement. We're employed at will. We've been fired for good cause, no cause, any cause. By the way, this is the only country in the world that has at-will employment. But that's another story. So I said, for 40 years, you and your colleagues in the Silicon Valley and have said to people they are responsible for their career. What I tell people is, when people tell you you're responsible for your career, take them seriously. Believe the message. Mm-hmm. Believe the message. You're responsible for your career means that you need to take care of yourself. And you cannot say, not that I'm a big Freudian, but what Freud would say is that ever since we're expelled from our mother's womb, we're looking for the protective, loving figure to take care of us, and it could be some godlike figure in his book Delusion and Dream, or it could be the big company that is going to take care of me. The company, I can lose myself in the company, and I can, and the company's going to look out for me. I don't see, maybe Google does that pretty well, and they probably do, but most companies don't. And so you need to take care of yourself. You're a fully functioning adult. Stop looking, for the maternal or paternal warmth and love. And this is a transactional world. It's not a nice, kind of a depressing way to look at it. But it's, on the other hand, as I tell people, I'm depressed when I see former students of mine lose their jobs. That to me is way more depressing than have them go into where they are with their eyes open.
So would your outcome be that folks reading your book would walk away saying, things are different than I wish and different than maybe I thought, and I need to operate differently as a result? Or that people would say, things are different than I would wish, and I want to figure out how to start to change that? Because I think you give advice in your book on both.
Both.
So
I would say both. I would say absolutely both. The subtitle of this book is Changing Workplaces and Careers, One Truth at a Time. I don't believe we're going to change the situation that exists in the world without understanding the psychological and sociological dynamics that produce this behavior. We need to understand where this comes from. We need to understand the rules of the game. I mean, if you're going to change, if we want fewer concussions in professional, or for that matter, amateur football, first thing we need to understand is, number one, how many concussions there are. And so one of the interesting things about the leadership industry is that there are all these recommendations. So my favorite trick for people who give these talks, which I hate, is to say, okay, you told me that leaders should tell the truth, or leaders eat last, Simon Sinek's book, or whatever. Can you give me an estimate of what percentage of leaders engage in this behavior. And of course, it's always met with silence. We have no measures of base rates. So if I said to you, so this is the difference between management and medicine. We've known for 400 years that if I want to encourage, if I want to produce healthy outcomes, hygiene is important. So we know doctors ought to wash their hands in antiseptic solutions. And we know that 60% of all SARS cases during the sudden acute respiratory distress syndrome were spread through the hands of healthcare workers. So we know. So here I would say you measure a base rate. What percentage of people wash their hands? Okay, why do they not wash their hands? Now we can figure out interventions. We can measure the effect of those interventions. In leadership, I want you to be authentic or take care of others or whatever. What percentage of people are doing it? I'm clueless. What are interventions that would cause a higher percentage of people to do it? I'm clueless because I haven't measured how many people are doing it. How can we possibly get any? There is no theory, science, or logic that would suggest that that is a situation in which things are going to improve. In order to improve, I have to know where they are. I have to understand, I have to try different experiments, which is something that Google does good, which is one. We have to run experiments. Just as you would run experiments on your website or on search engines or search results, you run experiments with this as well. And how are we doing? And are things getting better? Or are we not getting better? And if they're not getting better, why not? And that's the only way. This idea that the things are going to get better by telling ourselves our version of, your favorite fairy tale, I just don't see any evidence, is not a scintilla of it, nor is there any logic that suggests that that would make it any better. So on the one hand, I think we ought to try to make things better, and we ought to create a healthier, better world. The book that I'm currently writing, actually I'm writing 2 books, but I can hardly write one anymore because we just bought a new house and my wife has assigned me the job of fixing it up, which is interesting in any event, but it's fine. The book that I'm writing is the book that's mostly finished, and which I hope to finish reasonably soon. The working title is Dying for a Paycheck. And 2 colleagues who are much smarter mathematically than I, they're operations research people, built this wonderful model based upon epidemiological data and a meta-analysis we did, and based upon survey data, which tries to estimate incidence of this. Our estimate is 120,000 excess deaths a year in the United States from workplace stress, which, by the way, would make the workplace the 5th leading cause of death, behind heart disease and cancer, but ahead of Alzheimer's and diabetes. It's horrible. We literally have toxic workplaces, and we ought to do something about that. But if we're going to do something about that, we also need to understand. So I see all these pieces as being part of the
fitting together.
Fitting together.
You make a case, and as you just did here, that there is a ray of hope. We could potentially fix the problem, but before we can fix the problem, we have to understand the problem. And to understand the problem, we have to apply what we know about science and measurement to leadership and management, which luckily is something many of us we value here. We have a bunch of behavioral scientists here, and but I'm curious.
Not every place is like Google.
I'm curious. So where you see people doing the science well, and what we might be able to learn from. And you mentioned a couple of examples in the book of places where people incorporate what we know about behavior change, the science of behavior change, into practice, where we're asking people to set specific goals and give them feedback on those goals. And I think there are a few examples. What kinds of things would you leave us with as either people or institutions that are really doing good science in our arena, even if they are the minority?
Well, I don't know that many besides Google. I'm not sure. Google and SAS Institute, and probably a relatively small number of other places, because part of what I think distinguishes good leaders, good managers, good people is intellectual curiosity. And one of the striking things about life, I have a colleague named Dennis Tourish, Tourish, who some years ago did a survey. He's a Scottish professor, and he did a survey in which he asked Scottish executives, not what books were they reading, but had they read any? And the answer would astonish you. I mean, the level I mean, first of all, we live in a country where 25% of the people don't believe in evolution. So and that's a true figure. So it should not astonish you that we do not have a lot of people. We don't have a lot of companies doing what you're doing, which is having book talks. We don't have a lot of senior leaders who have any intellectual curiosity at all, like how things work. One of the things that I love about Gary Loveman is he would say, okay, you know, I want to teach my people how to think. So if people aren't doing, you know, if we're not getting a large share of their gaming dollar, why not? Why are they choosing the competitors? So you ask a series of analytical questions. And if the questions are asked well, you can figure out eventually how to get the data and do the analysis. But if you don't start with the questions, you're not going to get anywhere. And so I don't see, you know, the typical CEO. So I'll tell a story on one of your semi-competitors. So I have a dear friend named Roger Martin who just stepped down as the dean of the Rotman University of Toronto Business School. So Roger and I were together at a conference and we were talking about life and things, and we exchanged emails. And he said, you know, he said, it's amazing how there is this idea that if you're a CEO, any word that comes out of your mouth is correct. So he said that there's been a big controversy, as many of you know, about whether or not there's a real shortage of engineers and technical employees or not. And he's been very active in Toronto doing a strategic plan for the province of Ontario, and he's been very involved with Statistics Canada. And he engaged in an exchange with Microsoft about the issue of how many engineers there were and the number of engineers. And he has a thing which he forwarded to me from the Microsoft PR department that basically said if Bill Gates said it, it's true. The fact that, you know, literally, it's true. There's no evidence. The statistics from Canada, at least for the province of Ontario, which is where the debate was about, suggested that this is completely made up. It says it must be true. So we live in a world in which, you know, the CEOs kind of make stuff up. And, you know, we have a presidential candidate who makes stuff up. I mean, you know, immigrants cause crime. How do we know it? Because it came out of Donald Trump's mouth. There's not scintilla of evidence for this. There's studies of this, proportions of immigrants, proportions of that. I wrote the best-selling business book of all time. No, but, you know, it doesn't matter. If you say it, you know, and say it with enough conviction, it becomes true. So it's, in this kind of a world, it's, we need science, but it's not very prevalent. I'm sure you saw that when you were in Terra Nova Consulting and had to do.
It's true. Absolutely.
So how did you go about changing it?
Well, first, I will,
That's right.
Jeff said, is it okay if I ask you a couple questions? Which it is, but start thinking of your questions, because in a minute I'm going to, Cliff's ready with the mic and we'll hear from some of you. How did I go about changing it? I can't take responsibility for changing it, but I did join a place that really values science, and I think at Google, because we are an engineering-led organization and we value making decisions objectively, if you don't have the data, it sort of doesn't matter how compelling the case is, and what matters is that you are informed. And one of the things that I've seen here that I saw much less often when I was an external consultant is that our leaders will change their minds in the face of data. And that is something that you don't always see elsewhere. You don't see the data, you don't see it presented, you don't see people change their minds. So that's, and I think teaching people here, as we often do, and these folks in the room will help teach people. Teaching people to use data to help influence decision making is a critical capacity and capability to teach. Absolutely. Questions, folks? Cliff's there with the mic if you have one.
There's a lot of stuff at the moment about self-management. So get rid of managers, get rid of leaders.
Holacracy?
Yeah. So do you believe in that then?
I believe in holacracy. The evidence suggests over years and decades that people have been talking about the end of hierarchy for probably 70 years. And there are little experiments. I actually don't believe Zappos is such an experiment. As I've pointed out to several reporters, everything I say, of course, gets me into trouble, which is fine. That the idea that holacracy is imposed from on top and that anybody who doesn't agree with holacracy should leave is kind of a contradiction in the idea of self-management, but you know, whatever. But Ricardo Semler in Brazil has tried this and whatever. I think I think there are cooperative forms of organization that work. Mondragon in Spain, which we actually visited some years ago, the John Edwards Cooperative in the United Kingdom. There's certainly self-governing, semi-democratic forms of organizations, which include basically every law partnership, most of the public accounting partnerships, many management consulting firm partnerships, where they elect the CEO, and where the CEOs are elected at least by the partners. So that is a form of kind of self-governance and self-management. But hierarchy is, you know, if you read Herbert Simon, who's now deceased, you know, his book or the article that's based on the book, The Architecture of Complexity, hierarchy is pervasive in the natural world. You see hierarchy in schools of fish. You see hierarchy even in, apparently even our organisms more simple than schools of fish. Hierarchy is relatively pervasive. And, you know, I see, again, many of my students, or now ex-students, come into companies and they say, you know, well, you know, we're not political here. It's all, everybody's equal. That's probably not true. There's, you know, there's one CEO. There's, you know, one school superintendent. And in 2018, there's going to be a new governor of California. I don't see much evidence that non-hierarchical systems do very well, because in almost any size and complexity, the hierarchy emerges almost naturally. And my colleague Larissa Tedens did some studies that showed that when you give people a choice of how they want to organize, when you tell them they have to accomplish a task, they organize voluntarily into a hierarchical arrangement.
I have a question about how leadership is informed by multicultural companies. And you mentioned that you know, 10 to 20% of students may get laid off within the first 2 years. And
they don't get laid off, they get fired.
Or they get fired.
We need to be clear about that.
Okay. So can you comment whether you speculate that's because they go into a multicultural company, that they have to figure out different cultures because of that?
It happens, so I'll tell you a story which is going to sound so weird that you're going to believe it's made up, but it's not. So I have a woman, former student, who was actually a little even older, calls me on the phone one day, and she's like in tears because she needs to work, and she needs a job, and so she has been at a company, high-tech company, obviously not this company, and she is, what's the problem? She's about to be fired. Why? Because she has gone into the organization, and the organization said, we are an organization that believes in openness and transparency and continuous improvement. And therefore, you should tell everybody at all moments, kind of what we do in our class at Stanford called touchy-feely, interpersonal dynamics. You got to share your feelings and share your honest feedback with them. And you, in particular, ought to tell people what you think they're doing right and what they think they're doing wrong. And she shared her honest and open feedback. She had a boss. She didn't think the boss was very good, which was probably true. And she told the boss. Her career is over. And I said, now how? Yeah, I mean, this is a woman smart enough to get in Stanford Business School. She's actually smart, very smart. Smart but not wise. I said, why? What possessed you? You know, what momentary whatever? What was this? Was it demonic possession or something? She said, no. She said, the organization said, number one, we want to be continuously getting better. Sounded reasonable. And the best way to get continuously getting better is to provide people with open and honest feedback on how they're doing, which is, by the way, also factually correct. So they said, you know, they told me we want to get better. This makes sense, that I'm going to give people a constructive feedback in a constructive fashion so they can improve their performance. So I believe them. And I said to her, you know, did you ask? You know, did you do any due diligence on these statements? Like, what happened to the last person who gave constructive feedback? And where are they now? I mean, you know, it is this amazing. So one of the jokes that I sometimes make is if I sat up here and I said, I've discovered the cure for cancer and I will sell it to you or to Google for $500 million, which, by the way, had I discovered the cure for cancer, would be the biggest bargain in the history of life. How many of you are going to write me a check for $500 million? And the answer is nobody, because you will do due diligence. You will say, if I have a technology that is going to provide some medical benefit, or for that matter, any kind of technical benefit, we'll use medical benefit for the moment. You will do sufficient due diligence to understand, is the technology real? Are there patents? Is there intellectual property? Does it work? But when we see these leaders write the books or give the talks or whatever, we believe it uncritically. We don't even spend a nanosecond of doing due diligence. Is this true? What happened to the people? Are they living their beliefs? You know, I have friends, one of the friends is stimulated me to write this book who talks about himself as a leader. My God, all you have to do is go to the city where he spends a good portion of his time when he's not lecturing at Stanford and do a search. Public records are now, you know, public records. You can see the suits by his partners. Yeah, it's like, in 30 minutes you can, why? So part of this, so one of my recommendations is don't believe. You know, trust but verify or something. I mean, you know, get a little data. When people tell you a story, sign of it is true. You know, Volkswagen had a story that turned out not to be true. You can have a diesel car with great gas mileage. I don't think so, and they meet the emission standards. Maybe not. So we need to verify what we are told, and that is, I think, the first and most important thing. You know, is to just ask what's real, what's real, and what isn't.
So there's sort of a sense of, there's some coping strategies for dealing in today's real world, while at the same time
Yes.
getting the base rate measurement that it will enable us to affect change systematically using good scientific principles.
You know, one of the things that also drives me nuts is how we evaluate leadership development activities. Mm-hmm. So the leadership development industry is this huge industry. People go to these conferences, and at the end of the conference, you fill out a happy sheet. You know, did you have a good time? Were the donuts good or whatever? I mean, you know, kind of, it's interesting. And we know that for 4 decades ago, in the early 1970s, was, to the best of my ability to discern it, the first study of the relationship between instructor ratings and objective measures of learning. So it was a calculus class. A big state universities, you know, a big calculus class where in the olden days, before the invention of technology, so these enormous tiered classrooms, and they, you know, heard some some professor lecture about calculus, and then they put everybody in discussion sections. And at the end of the semester, everybody took the same test. Mm-hmm. They were randomly assigned essentially to sections. So here's the perfect thing. You can ask, to what extent is there a correlation between teacher ratings, the course section ratings, and objective measures of learning? The answer is 0. And that's 40 years of research has demonstrated that. It's no different in the leadership development industry. We are rewarding entertainment, we're getting entertainment. And that's another reason why there's absolutely no progress. Yeah. So, you know, one of my favorite stories in this book, somebody was considering me for a talk. They chose somebody else. So I said, you know, it's fine. She was actually, like many times, this woman called me and told me that they hadn't chosen me. I said, can you explain to me the selection criteria? She said, yeah. She said, we picked somebody else and gave me the name. Because he's better looking. And I went, you know, by the way, I'm on the web, he is better looking. I'd have picked him too. But that's an interesting, think about this. Next time you go look at the conference, and who's big on the conference circuit? People who have compelling, interesting stories. Do they know anything? Absolutely not. But, you know.
Or maybe not, we don't know. Because we're not measuring it. We don't know.
We don't even know.
Okay, Debbie.
All right, thanks. Another lens that we try to look at leadership through at Google is the lens of diversity and asking our leaders to be inclusive leaders. And we're really trying to get that right. Are there any hard truths about that we should understand, or what do you think?
Well, not beyond the hard truth that you probably already know, which is that people love people who remind them of themselves. I mean, you know, there's my favorite. It's a short. I love the New York Times. Their science section is fabulous. So some years ago, a guy named Benedict Carey wrote a nice article called "You Remind Me of Me," which of course reminds us of the fact that we love people who look like us, sound like us. I mean, this is about behavioral imitation. So one of the things, I actually talked about this morning in an executive education class I was talking at Stanford. And a woman raised her hand and she said, what is your recommendation? My recommendation is, you know, if behavioral imitation works and there's no evidence that it doesn't, then you ought to imitate. You don't have to you know, get a sex change operation, but you can imitate, you know, gestures, and you can imitate, intonation. I don't know, I'm sure some people in this room have seen Amy J.C. Cuddy's TED Talk on power posing. Absolutely, that's, so I mean, you can do things that, and use dialect or inflection or words or gestures, whatever. And that, by the way, cuts across race or gender. You can use behavioral imitation so that even though I don't look like you, or you don't look like me, or we don't look like each other, you can look in the sense of the use of language, in the sense of some other stuff. So you can take the fact that we understand similarities, the basis of interpersonal attraction, and use that. And you can say, I've seen some women in particular, or people of color do, which is to remind the people that they're interacting with what they have in common. So I may be different, but there are many things that we have in common. We work in the same organization. We went to the same university. We're stuck on the same airplane, which is going nowhere. Or whatever this is that we have in common. So you can find those things.
That's an interesting example of how I see you over and over and over take the research, social psychology in this case, and in many cases, take the social psychology research and say, if this is true, then how do we create a better world around that? And how do we operate realistically in the world we're in today? Sure. And I think those are the two, one of the many tensions you create in your book is how do we hold true operate effectively in the world in which we are functioning, and at the same time work to make it a world in which we'd like to be functioning. And that's the kind of the hope and fear aspects of your book. I think, Debbie, and it's interesting to think about, to your question, how we can help leaders be the ones to find the thing they have in common and take the onus off of people who want to be seen for all they have to contribute as having to also then build that connection, but have leaders really looking for that.
So you mentioned about people dying from workplace stress, and I just read about a company that instituted a 5-hour workday. So I'm wondering, how do you balance not enforcing a 5-hour workday, but saying, please take one, and then not having the social pressure of people wanting to show leadership by then not abiding by a 5-hour workday?
Well, work hours is one source of problem, but the biggest source of workplace, there are two sources. So work hours is obviously a source of workplace stress, particularly to the extent that it entails and engages work-family conflict. But the biggest sources of workplace stress are, number one, economic insecurity. So, people with families and mortgages have economic obligations that don't come and go. And there are many places, our friend down the road at HP, which is near as I could determine can only do layoffs. I believe that's what they manufacture today. So somebody said, what does HP make? I said they make layoffs on a regular basis. It's not really a joking matter. There's a large epidemiological literature on the harmful health effects of being laid off. Economic insecurity is an enormous source of stress in today's economy, where you have people in the so-called freelance or gig economy. You have companies, Caterpillar, HP, which we made a joke about. Companies are laying people off all the time. That's an enormous source of economic of workplace stress. A second source of workplace stress is an absence of job control. So the question isn't how hard you work. The question is, do you have any discretion on, so if I give you a task to do, it could be a challenging task, but if you have some discretion on the resources that you muster and when you do it and how you do it, that's much less stressful than saying to you, by the way, I need to report by noon, and it's now 10 in the morning. Oh, never mind, I need a different report by noon. Oh, never mind, I need you to go. So I have a friend who works for a company that should remain nameless, but it's not going to remain nameless in my in the Dying for a Paycheck book. We're supposed to go out with Sutha and Seema. The joke is they are the Indian children we never had, because we don't have any children, but we love them like children, and they love us like parents or something, or actually like friends. And Seema, who works for some very fancy Bay Area company, Sutha's emails me Saturday morning. This is Saturday morning. We're going to see them Saturday night to go to the Marsh in San Francisco, dinner at range beforehand. What should we do? Seema has been told this morning to get on a plane. By the way, she's also 7 months pregnant. To get on a plane, be in Europe on Sunday to do a sales and marketing meeting on Monday. No control. That's stressful. Not, we're going to give you 5 weeks notice. Not we're going to ask, what is your preference to get the work done that we have? You know, you're a marketing executive in this company. There's some responsibilities. You don't want to go on maternity leave yet. That's fine. Here's some stuff you need to get accomplished. Figure out how to do it. That's very different. By the way, she has an MBA from Harvard. Smart woman. Even though it's from Harvard, it's fine. It's very different than saying, I am your boss. Get your ass on an airplane tonight. Different, very different. That's stressful. That is, I have no control over my life. Someone at any moment could have me doing stuff. Not, I got a set of jobs, tasks to accomplish. This is, go here, go there, do that. Not a good thing. Third source of stress, which is also controllable, prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, and actually post the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which is not very affordable. Third source of stress is that many people in this country do not have access to decent medical care because they don't have decent health insurance. Even company-provided health insurance, many people aren't covered. The co-pays have gone up, blah, blah, blah. So I know people, you know, stressed out about how do I care for myself and my family, you know, with health issues and all of that kind of stuff. So there are many dimensions of stress besides the work hours. And the work hours, you know, my friend Jim Goodnight at SAS Institute would say, he'd say, you know, he said, my job as the leader of SAS is to try to get all the unnecessary stuff out of your life so that if you actually work 40 hours a week, you'd work 30 hours more than you're currently working. Unproductive stuff, as opposed to dealing with, you know, the bureaucracy and the useless meetings and the stresses. The wonderful thing that we've done in benefits administration, hopefully not at Google, but who knows, where we've said everybody needs to be an expert on everything. So we're going to have self-directed retirement accounts. We're going to have self-directed medical stuff. Everybody's responsible for everything. So everybody has to become an expert. I wrote a column about this when Business 2.0 was still alive. So this is more than a decade ago, in which I said, what happened to Adam Smith and the idea of the division of labor? That a sensible thing to do would be to say, I'm not going to make everybody, particularly people not as educated as the people in this room, experts on financial planning and financial investments and, you know, and certainly what I do in my own medical care. My next word of advice is don't get old, nothing good comes of it. But what I do with respect to my own medical care is I spend not a minute becoming an expert on whatever my current malady is. I spend a lot of time figuring out who is. So when I had spine surgery 2 years ago, I mean, I'm not going to tell him how to do the surgery, but I am going to make sure that I found absolutely the best person to do this. So if anybody needs spine surgery, I can give you a
So we've had a teaser into your next book as well. I'm conscious many of you are going to rush to 2 o'clock meetings, and I'm going to stop us now so that those of you who didn't get a signed book beforehand and want to can get one now at the back of the room. And thank you so much, and primarily Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure meeting you. Thank you.